The private wing of the hospital had gone eerily quiet except for the rhythmic beep of a machine somewhere down the corridor, and Mark Villegas, a man who had never in his adult life let anyone see him rattled, was moving fast, jacket gone, sleeves shoved up his forearms, snapping orders at anyone in scrubs who crossed his path. Two of his men trailed behind him, unsure whether to keep pace or give him room. A nurse stepped into his path and pressed both hands flat against his chest, the only thing in that hallway with the nerve to stop him. And for one long, unbearable second, Mark Villegas, a man 3 rival organizations feared and every dirty official in the county answered to, stood frozen outside a closed door, powerless, waiting to learn whether the 2 people he loved most in the world would make it through the night. How does a man like that end up here? How does a woman who once smelled like rosemary and burnt sugar end up on the other side of a door he can't force open with money, threats, or fear? Stay with me. Because the answer starts somewhere much smaller and much quieter than this, in a catering kitchen with a cracked tile floor and a radio that only picked up one station, and a young woman named Brenda Hoffman who had no idea, on an unremarkable Tuesday, that her whole life was about to be rewritten. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you're already hooked on today's story and ready to enjoy it, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one. And you don't want to miss it. Now, let us begin. Brenda was 27, with dark curls that never stayed pinned no matter how many times she twisted them up before a shift, and a laugh that carried through a kitchen even on the worst days. She was curvy, unapologetically, deliberately so, the kind of woman who took up space like she'd earned the right to it because she had. People underestimated her constantly. It had always been their mistake. She'd buried her father 18 months earlier and inherited, along with his recipes and his stubbornness, a catering business hemorrhaging money faster than she could patch it. Hoffman's table sat in a converted storefront 2 blocks from the water, its ovens older than she was, its walls lined with photographs of weddings and anniversaries she'd helped make beautiful for other people while her own bank statements told a very different story. She kept most of that to herself. Even from her younger brother, Danny, 22 and still finishing his degree, still believing, because she let him believe it, that everything was fine. It stopped being fine on a gray Thursday afternoon when a black car with windows tinted the color of a held breath parked outside the kitchen and idled a beat too long before a man got out of it. He was tall, built like the suit had been designed around him rather than the other way around, dark hair cut close, and a face that looked like it hadn't relaxed in years. He didn't hurry. Men like him never had to. The bell over the kitchen door, the same bell that announced every delivery and every regular customer, rang thin and small under the sudden weight of him walking in. "Mr. Villegas," said Ruth, the bookkeeper, and her voice cracked on his name. His eyes moved over the kitchen, the mismatched pans, the handwritten menu on the chalkboard, the flour dusting every surface, before landing on Brenda, who stood at the counter with a rolling pin still in her hand and a streak of butter on her sleeve. Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could name it. "We need to talk," he said, "about the loan your father took out. And what happens now that it's due." Brenda set the rolling pin down slowly. "What loan?" Nobody answered her. "1 week," he said, to Ruth, not to Brenda, as though she weren't standing close enough to hear her own heartbeat in her ears. "I'd hate for this to get unpleasant." He turned to go. Then, almost against his own will, his gaze cut back to Brenda one more time, half a second longer than it needed to, before he walked out and let the bell ring behind him like a door closing on a life neither Hoffman had agreed to give up. His name, Brenda would learn over the following 2 frantic days of hushed phone calls and worse paperwork, was Mark Villegas. 35 years old. Depending on who you asked, either the most respected man in the state or the most feared, usually both opinions from the same mouth. What almost no one outside his innermost circle knew, what Brenda had no way of knowing yet, was that Mark Villegas carried a wound no amount of money could fix. Years earlier, after quiet, humiliating rounds of tests run under a false name to protect what was left of his privacy, he'd been told, plainly and permanently, that he would never have a child of his own. He'd built a fortress out of that grief instead of a family and told himself it was enough. But empires didn't run on grief. They ran on succession. And lately, the men circling the edges of his organization had started smelling weakness in a king with no heir, no one more eagerly than his uncle, Victor, soft-spoken and endlessly agreeable, a man Mark had never once thought to be suspicious of. Mark didn't want a wife. He wanted to be left alone with his ledgers and his liquor and the particular silence of a house too big for one man. But he understood leverage better than almost anyone alive, and a marriage, even an empty, arranged one, could buy him room to breathe while he figured out how to hold everything together with both hands. He hadn't expected the solution his own family handed him to walk into his life smelling like brown butter, with flour on her sleeve. That night, Ruth told Brenda everything in halting, guilty pieces: the debt her father had taken from Mark's organization years before, the interest neither of them had understood, and the offer that had arrived folded inside the threat. Marry Brenda to Mark Viegas, and the debt disappeared. Along with the foreclosure notice. Along with every sleepless night Ruth had spent trying to hide it. "You don't have to say yes," Ruth whispered, hands shaking around a mug of cold coffee. "I would never ask you to." "I know," Brenda said, and reached across the table for her hand. She thought, that night, about her father, about everything he'd given up without ever once making her feel like a burden for it. She thought about Danny and the tuition due in the fall. She thought, unwillingly, about the strange half-second flicker in a stranger's eyes that hadn't matched the cold flatness of his voice. She told herself none of it mattered. She said yes before she let herself think too hard about what she was agreeing to. The morning had started like every other morning at Hoffman's table, badly and too early and smelling faintly of burnt sugar because the oven in the back still ran 15 degrees hotter than the dial claimed. Brenda Hoffman had been up since 5, elbow deep in a wedding order for 80 that some bride named Casey wanted rustic but elegant, whatever that meant this week, and she hadn't stopped moving since. She liked it that way. Movement left less room for thinking, and thinking lately only led her back to the numbers. The numbers were bad. She knew this the way you know a storm is coming before the sky actually breaks, a feeling in the joints, an ache she couldn't quite name. Ruth kept the books, had kept them since Brenda's father ran the place, and Ruth had gotten very good, this past year, at changing the subject whenever Brenda asked how bad actually was. "You've got that look again," Brenda said, setting a chipped mug of coffee in front of Ruth at the little desk crammed into the corner near the register. "The one where you're doing math in your head, and none of it's adding up." Ruth managed a thin smile that didn't reach anywhere close to her eyes. "It's nothing, sweetheart. Just a slow month." "Ruth, drink your coffee before it gets cold." Brenda let it go, because that was usually how these conversations ended, Ruth waving a hand like she could physically push the subject out of the room, and Brenda too tired, too stretched thin across 80 rustic but elegant appetizers, to fight her on it. But she'd noticed things. The way Ruth had started taking phone calls out on the sidewalk, back to the window, voice pitched too low to carry through the glass. The way she flinched now whenever the shop phone rang unexpectedly, like it might be carrying bad news instead of a catering order. The stack of envelopes that had begun collecting in the drawer beneath the register, return addresses turned carefully face down, like if she couldn't see them they might stop being real. Her father had died 18 months ago, quick and unfair, a heart that gave out on an ordinary Sunday, and Brenda had inherited the business the way you inherit a house with a leaking roof, gratefully, and then increasingly, with dread. She had his recipes memorized. She had his stubbornness in her spine. What she hadn't inherited, apparently, was the full truth about the state of things, and she was beginning to suspect that truth had teeth. She found out exactly how sharp on a gray Thursday afternoon, the kind where the light through the front windows turned everything the color of an old photograph. She was piping ganache onto a tray of test cakes when she heard it, the low, expensive purr of an engine outside, idling a beat too long. She glanced up in time to see a black car pull to the curb, windows tinted the color of a held breath, and a man step out of it like the sidewalk owed him something. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in a way that made his charcoal suit look less like clothing and more like architecture. Dark hair cut close and precise, a jaw that looked like it had never once in its life fully relaxed. He didn't hurry crossing the street. Men like that never had to hurry anywhere. The world simply waited. The bell over the kitchen door, the same bell that announced every flower delivery and every regular ordering their Tuesday cannoli, rang thin and small under the sudden weight of him walking in. Ruth's face went the color of old paper. Mr. Villegas. His eyes moved over the kitchen, the mismatched sheet pans, the chalkboard menu, the flour dusted across every surface like a light snow, before landing on Brenda, standing at the counter with a piping bag still in one hand and a smear of butter on her sleeve. Something shifted in his expression, quick and almost imperceptible, like a door cracking open a half-inch before someone remembered to shut it. "We need to talk," he said, and his voice was low, clipped, the kind that didn't need volume to fill a room, "about the loan your father took out against this business. And about what happens now that it's due." Brenda set the piping bag down slowly. "What loan?" Nobody answered her. "1 week," he said, looking only at Ruth, as though Brenda weren't standing 3 feet away with her heart suddenly hammering somewhere up near her throat. "I'll expect your answer in 1 week, Mrs. Alvarez. I'd hate for this to become unpleasant." He turned to leave. Then, almost as an afterthought, his gaze cut back to Brenda one more time, lingering half a second longer than politeness required, before he walked out. The bell rang behind him like a period at the end of a sentence neither Hoffman woman had agreed to. His name, Brenda learned over the following 48 frantic hours of whispered explanations from Ruth, was Mark Villegas. He ran an empire that was legitimate on paper and considerably less legitimate underneath it, private security contracts, real estate holdings, the kind of quiet influence that didn't advertise itself but didn't need to. He was 35. Depending on who you asked, he was either the most respected man in 3 counties or the most feared one, and usually both opinions came from the same person. What Brenda didn't know, what she had no way of knowing yet, standing in her kitchen with flour on her sleeve and her whole world tilting sideways, was that the debt her father had taken out years ago had ballooned quietly, viciously, with interest neither he nor Ruth had ever fully understood. And that the man who'd just walked out the door was about to become the answer to a problem Brenda hadn't even known she had. Ruth told her everything that night, in halting, guilty pieces, at the kitchen table with 2 mugs of coffee going cold between them. The loan Brenda's father had taken out 4 years back, when the walk-in freezer died, and a wedding season loss nearly sank them both. The interest that had crept up quietly, the way rot does, invisible until the floorboard gives out from under you. The calls Ruth had been fielding for months, each one a little colder than the last, each one ending with a number that made her stomach drop. 40,000, Ruth said finally, staring into her mug like the answer might be hiding at the bottom of it. "That's what it's grown to. I didn't know how to tell you. I kept thinking I'd find a way to fix it before you had to know. You should have told me." "I know." Ruth's voice cracked. "I know, sweetheart. I'm sorry." Brenda didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, a car passed, headlights sweeping briefly across the kitchen wall before the room went dark again. $40,000. She thought about Danny, about the tuition bill sitting unopened in her own bag because she hadn't wanted to look at it yet, about the shop with her father's name still stenciled on the window, about all the ways a single bad decade could undo 3 generations of careful, stubborn work. The offer came 2 days later, delivered not by Mark Villegas himself, but by a man in a gray suit who introduced himself only as counsel and slid a single folded sheet of paper across the table like it was nothing at all. Marriage. A year, minimum, though the paper was vague about what came after. In exchange, the debt would be forgiven in full and forgotten. The man's word, forgotten, along with any further contact from the Villegas organization regarding it. "You don't have to say yes," Ruth whispered that night, tears sliding freely down her face. "I would never ask you to." "I know you wouldn't," Brenda said quietly, and reached across the table to take her aunt's shaking hand. She thought about her father that night, lying awake and staring at a water stain on her ceiling that had never quite gone away no matter how many times the landlord promised to fix the roof. She thought about everything he'd sacrificed for her without ever once making her feel like a burden for needing it. She thought about Danny, 22, 3 semesters from a degree he'd worked too hard for to lose now over money that wasn't even his fault. She thought, too, about a stranger's eyes in her kitchen doorway, the strange half-second flicker of something that hadn't matched the cold flatness of his voice, and told herself firmly that it didn't matter, that it changed nothing. She signed the paper before she let herself think too hard about what exactly she was agreeing to. The wedding, when it came, was small and gray, and over almost before it started. 20 guests, most of them Villegas family, watching Brenda with the polite, assessing eyes of people evaluating a piece of furniture they weren't sure matched the rest of the room. She wore a simple ivory dress Ruth had altered by hand 2 nights running, staying up past midnight both times, refusing every offer of help. Mark wore black, because apparently the man owned nothing that wasn't the color of a closed door, and stood beside her at the front of the small chapel with the composed, distant patience of someone attending a business closing rather than a wedding. Neither of them smiled. Brenda kept her chin up anyway, the way her father had taught her to when life handed her something heavier than she'd asked to carry. When the officiant pronounced them married, Mark's hand closed around hers, brief, formal, correct, and Brenda told herself, sitting afterward in the back of the black car carrying them away from the chapel, that she would survive this the way she'd survived everything else. Quietly, stubbornly, one day at a time. She expected the drive to be silent. It mostly was, except once, somewhere past the edge of the city, when he glanced sideways at her and said, without any particular warmth, "You didn't cry." "Should I have?" "Most women in your position would have." "Not most women," Brenda said, watching the hills roll by outside the window. "And I already did my crying last night. Alone, when nobody was around to see it." He didn't answer that. But something shifted in the set of his jaw, and he didn't say anything else for the rest of the drive, though she noticed, because she noticed everything, that he kept glancing at her out of the corner of his eye the whole way there. The house appeared at the end of a long gravel drive behind iron gates, stone and imposing, its windows tall and dark against a sky just beginning to bruise toward evening. Brenda sat very still as the car slowed to a stop, looking up at it through the window, and felt, for the first time since the man in the gray suit had slid that folded paper across her table, the full weight of what she'd actually agreed to. Whatever came next, whatever kind of life waited for her behind those doors, she had no way yet of knowing that this cold, businesslike arrangement, built on a debt and a signature and nothing resembling love, was about to become the thing that saved her. Or that it would cost her, before the end, almost everything she thought she understood about the man sitting silently beside her. The car came to a stop beneath a portico wide enough to fit 3 of the vehicles Brenda had ever owned, and for a moment neither of them moved. A man in a dark coat appeared at her door before she could reach for the handle herself, and she stepped out into air that smelled like cut grass and something colder underneath it, something that might have been money or might have been distance. She couldn't tell yet which. The house rose up in front of her, stone and iron and glass, 3 stories of quiet, deliberate weight. It didn't look like a home so much as a statement, the kind of building that existed to remind everyone who looked at it exactly where they stood. Mark came around the car without a word and started up the steps, and Brenda, after a moment of standing there feeling smaller than she wanted to admit, followed him. Inside, the hallways were wide enough to swallow sound whole. Her footsteps didn't echo so much as disappear, absorbed into thick rugs and high ceilings and the particular hush of a house built for people who valued silence over warmth. A woman introduced herself as Elena, the housekeeper, kind-eyed and quick with a smile that seemed genuine even under the circumstances, and led Brenda up a curved staircase to a bedroom at the end of the east wing. It was larger than her entire apartment back in the city. A 4-poster bed. A window seat overlooking hills that had already begun turning violet in the fading light. A closet, empty, waiting. "Mr. Villegas asked that you have whatever you need," Elena said, hovering in the doorway. "Anything at all. You only have to ask." Brenda thanked her and stood alone in the enormous room once the door clicked shut, arms wrapped tightly around herself, waiting for whatever came next.
a demand,
an instruction. Something that would finally match the reputation of the man she'd just married, the one Ruth had gone pale over, the one an entire county apparently crossed the street to avoid. Instead, a knock came a half-hour later, soft, almost hesitant, and when she opened the door, Mark stood there in his shirt sleeves, tie already gone, jacket abandoned somewhere between the chapel and here. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, less like an empire and more like a very tired man standing in a very large house. "You don't owe me a child," he said, without preamble, without softness. Just fact, laid plainly on the table between them. Brenda blinked at him. Of everything she'd braced herself to hear, that hadn't made the list. "You don't owe me anything," he continued, "except honesty. I'll expect that much." She didn't know what to say to that. So, for a long moment she said nothing at all, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, like he'd expected an argument and gotten something closer to a truce instead. "I'm not going to pretend this is a real marriage," he said. "But I won't treat you like furniture, either. You have a room. You have a life here if you want to build one. Elena can take you into town tomorrow if you need anything, clothes, whatever you didn't bring. I'll have an account set up in your name by the end of the week. You'll want for nothing here. That's not a kindness. It's how I run things." "That's a strange kind of wedding vow," Brenda said finally, and something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face before he caught it and put it away again. "I don't make vows I can't keep," he said. "Consider it the only one that matters." He left her there with that, footsteps fading down the hall, and Brenda sat on the edge of the enormous bed for a long time afterward, turning his words over like she might find something hidden underneath them if she looked hard enough. She didn't find anything. Just a man who'd told her, in his own blunt way, that he intended to keep his word, which was, she supposed, more than most people offered for free. The first week settled into a strange, careful rhythm. Mark left early most mornings, back late most nights, and their paths crossed mostly at breakfast, where he read reports instead of newspapers, and she learned quickly not to expect conversation before his second cup of coffee. He wasn't unkind. He was simply absent in the particular way of men who'd spent their whole lives believing that presence was a weakness they couldn't afford. She explored the house on her own, mostly, trailing her fingers along bookshelves that hadn't been touched in years, finding a kitchen that was enormous and gleaming and almost entirely unused. The household ate whatever the private chef prepared, portioned and plated with a formality that made Brenda's chest ache faintly for the chaos of her own kitchen back home. She missed the noise of it, the radio that only picked up one station, Ruth's laugh carrying through the walls. She didn't miss the fear, though. The envelopes turned face down, the sound of the phone ringing and the flinch that came with it. That fear, at least, was gone, traded for a different kind of unease, the quiet, watchful uncertainty of living inside a stranger's life, waiting to learn what kind of man he actually was underneath the composed, distant surface he showed the world. She was beginning to suspect, though she wasn't ready yet to admit it even to herself, that the answer might be more complicated than anyone had warned her. It was the pasta that started it in the end. Small things usually do. 2 weeks in, Brenda found herself standing in the estate's enormous kitchen at 9 in the evening, unable to sleep, unable to stop her hands from wanting something to do. The private chef had gone home hours ago. The counters gleamed, untouched, in a way that had bothered her since her first day there, a professional kitchen with nobody actually cooking in it, all that beautiful copper cookware hanging decorative and cold. She found flour in a canister nobody had opened in what looked like months. Eggs in the walk-in, more than any household could reasonably need. And before she'd fully decided to do it, she was cracking them into a well of flour on the marble island, the way her father had taught her when she was 7 years old and barely tall enough to reach the counter, working the dough with the heel of her hand until it came together the way it was supposed to. She didn't hear Mark come in until he was already standing in the doorway. "Elena said the chef doesn't work nights," he said. Not quite a question. "He doesn't." I couldn't sleep. She didn't look up from the dough. "I hope that's not a problem. It's your kitchen, too." Something in the way he said it, flat, matter of fact, like he actually meant it, made her glance up. He'd shed his jacket somewhere, sleeves rolled, and he was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place, somewhere between curiosity and something more careful than that. "You cook," he said. "I ran a catering business. Cooking is most of what I know how to do." She rolled the dough flat, reached for a knife. "Sit down if you want. It's going to be a while. Or don't, if you've got somewhere better to be." He didn't leave. He pulled out one of the stools at the island and sat, and after a moment, watching her cut the dough into ragged, uneven strips that would never have passed inspection in a real restaurant kitchen, he reached over and picked up a knife of his own. "You're doing that wrong," she said. "I'm cutting pasta. You're cutting it wrong. Here." She reached over and adjusted his grip without thinking twice about it, the way she would have corrected anyone in her own kitchen back home, and only realized a half-second too late whose hand she'd just grabbed. Mark Viegas. A man 3 counties were apparently afraid to look directly in the eye. She'd just told him he was holding a knife wrong. He didn't pull away. "Better?" "Better," she admitted. They worked in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable but wasn't unpleasant either, the kind of silence that filled itself in slowly with small, unimportant things, the sound of the knife against the board, water starting to boil on the stove, the low hum of the refrigerator. Brenda found herself talking without entirely meaning to, filling the space the way she always had, telling him about Winston the Owl, about her father's terrible habit of adding too much garlic to everything, about the particular hell of catering an outdoor wedding in July. He didn't talk much back, but he listened, in a way she hadn't expected from a man who spent most of his waking hours reading reports at breakfast and disappearing behind closed doors for calls she wasn't meant to overhear. And once, only once, when she described Winston's flat, unimpressed stare at every customer who walked through the shop door, something crossed his face that was unmistakably, briefly, a real smile. "You should do that more," she said, before she could stop herself. "Do what?" "That. Smile like you mean it, instead of like you're doing someone a favor." He didn't answer that, but he didn't look away either, and the moment stretched a beat longer than either of them seemed prepared for. Brenda turned back to the stove, suddenly very interested in whether the water had come to a boil. They ate at nearly midnight, at the island instead of the long formal dining table she'd been avoiding since her first night there, and it was, she thought, the first meal she'd actually enjoyed since arriving. Simple food. No staff hovering. Just the two of them and a pot of pasta that wouldn't have impressed anyone but tasted, in that kitchen, at that hour, like something closer to peace than she'd expected to find in this house. "This is better than what Antoine makes," Mark said, and it sounded almost reluctant, like the admission cost him something. "Antoine's food is beautiful. It's just not food you're supposed to actually enjoy eating. There's a difference." "Is there?" "There is if you ask me. Nobody ever does, though." "I'm asking," he said, and something about the quiet, deliberate way he said it made her look up at him again, and this time neither of them looked away first. It became a habit after that, without either of them ever quite naming it as one. Some nights he was too buried in work to come down, but more nights than not, she'd hear his footsteps in the hallway around 9 or 10, and by the time he reached the kitchen doorway, she'd already have flour on her hands and something simmering on the stove, and the cold, careful distance between them would ease, just slightly, one shared meal at a time. Mark left for Chicago on a Tuesday, some meeting he described only as necessary and didn't elaborate on further, and Brenda had grown accustomed enough to his absences by then that she didn't think much of it beyond a small, surprising twinge of missing the sound of his footsteps in the hallway at night. The alarm woke her a little after 2 in the morning. Not the shrill, obvious kind she might have expected, but a low, insistent chime from the panel built into her nightstand, one Elena had shown her on her second day and told her, almost as an afterthought, to take seriously if it ever went off. She took it seriously. By the time she reached the hallway, 2 of the household staff were already awake, gathered near the top of the stairs with the wide, uncertain eyes of people who'd been trained for a great many things but not, apparently, for this. A young woman named Sophia, barely 20, one of the kitchen staff, was shaking. "Perimeter breach," said the older man beside her, one of the security detail who normally shadowed Mark rather than the house itself, most of the real security having traveled with him to Chicago. East Gate. We don't know how many. Brenda felt her heart drop somewhere low and cold in her chest, but her voice, when it came, surprised her with how steady it was. How long until backup gets here? 12 minutes. Maybe more. 12 minutes. She thought of her father, of the year she'd spent alone running a shop that had nearly gone under twice, of every crisis she'd talked herself through with nothing but a head for numbers and a refusal to fall apart in front of people who were counting on her not to. This wasn't so different, she told herself. Just higher stakes. Okay, she said. Everyone into the wine cellar.
Now.
It locks from the inside, and it's below ground. Elena showed me on my first week. Nobody moved for a beat, and Brenda understood, distantly, that they were waiting for someone else to be in charge, someone who actually belonged in this house giving orders. She didn't have time to explain that she felt exactly as unqualified as they looked. Now, she said again, sharper this time, and that seemed to do it. She herded Sophia and two others down the back stairs, past the kitchen she'd come to think of as half hers, toward the heavy door at the end of the hall that led below. What about you? Sophia asked, hovering at the threshold. I'm right behind you. She wasn't sure yet if that was true. She got them inside, heard the lock engage with a solid, reassuring thunk, and then stood alone in the dark hallway with her pulse hammering in her ears, weighing whether going back upstairs was bravery or stupidity. Somewhere outside, faint but unmistakable, she heard voices raised in the distance and the security man's radio crackling with static and clipped, urgent words she couldn't fully make out. She thought about hiding. She thought, instead, about the ledger in Mark's study, about anything in this house that might matter enough to someone to risk this, and made a decision she'd spend the rest of the night second-guessing. She went to the study, gathered what looked important from the desk without stopping to read any of it, and locked herself inside the adjoining panic room Elena had also shown her, the existence of which had struck her at the time as faintly absurd. It didn't strike her as absurd now. The 12 minutes felt like an hour. She sat on the floor with her knees drawn up, listening to her own breathing, until finally, she heard real voices in the hallway outside, familiar ones, the security detail confirming the breach had been contained at the perimeter, whoever it was gone before they'd made it past the outer wall. Mark arrived just before dawn, having turned the plane around somewhere over Ohio the moment he'd gotten the call, and found her still awake in the kitchen with Sophia and the others, having made them all tea because it was the only thing her hands had known how to do once the adrenaline started to fade. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, really looked, the way he had that first day in the shop, except there was nothing cold in it now. You should have gone straight to the panic room, he said finally low, and she could hear, underneath the correction, something that sounded almost like fear. I got everyone else somewhere safe first. That wasn't your job. It became my job the second I was the only one standing there, she said, and something in his jaw tightened the way it had that first day in the car, except this time she understood exactly what it meant. He didn't argue with her again. He crossed the kitchen instead and, for the first time since their wedding day, reached for her, not formal, not correct, just his hand closing briefly and firmly around hers, like he needed to confirm for himself that she was actually there, actually fine. Thank you, he said quietly, and it cost him something to say it, she could tell. For keeping them safe. You'd have done the same. That's not the point. He didn't let go of her hand right away. The point is you didn't have to. And you did anyway. Later, once the house had gone quiet again and Sophia and the others had finally been coaxed back to their own beds, Brenda sat across from him at the kitchen island in the gray early light and understood, with a clarity that unsettled her more than the breach itself had, that something between them had shifted for good. He was looking at her differently now, like she'd earned something he didn't hand out easily. She wasn't entirely sure yet what to do with that. The dinner had been Mark's idea, which was, in itself, unusual enough that Brenda should have suspected something was different about the night before it even began. A handful of business associates, wives and partners she'd met only in passing, the long formal dining table finally put to use instead of avoided in favor of the kitchen island. She'd spent the afternoon going over the menu with Antoine, Insisting on a few adjustments he clearly found beneath him, and had dressed carefully in deep red, the kind of dress that made her feel, for once, entirely certain of herself. She hadn't felt right all day, if she was honest. A low, persistent unease in her stomach she'd chalked up to nerves, or to the wine she'd sampled that afternoon while finalizing pairings, or simply to the particular exhaustion of hosting people she was supposed to charm without quite knowing the rules of the game she was playing. By the time the second course arrived, the steak Antoine had prepared with a reduction Brenda privately thought was too heavy. The smell of it hit her wrong. Not just unappetizing. Wrong, in a way that made the room tilt slightly at the edges. She set her fork down. Beside her, Mark glanced over, some instinct in him apparently attuned enough to notice the change in her before she'd fully registered it herself. "Brenda." "I'm fine," she said, and heard, distantly, how unconvincing it sounded even to her own ears. The room had gone strange and bright at the edges, sound arriving a half-second delayed, like she was hearing the table's conversation through water. She stood, meaning to excuse herself, meaning to make it to the hallway with some shred of dignity intact, and the last thing she remembered clearly was Mark's chair scraping back hard against the floor, his voice sharp and close, and then the floor rising up to meet her far faster than seemed reasonable. She woke in a hospital bed with fluorescent light overhead and Mark in a chair pulled close beside it, his tie gone, sleeve shoved up, looking like a man who hadn't sat still in hours. "You fainted," he said, before she could ask. "At the table. You've been out for almost 40 minutes. The dinner? Doesn't matter." His voice was low, clipped, the same voice she'd first heard in her kitchen doorway months ago, except now it was aimed entirely at holding itself together rather than at her. "The doctor wants to talk to us. Both of us." The doctor, when she came in, was younger than Brenda expected, unhurried in a way that felt deliberate, the kind of calm reserved for delivering news that required steady hands on both ends of the conversation. "Mrs. Villegas," she said, "your blood work came back. I want to walk you through it carefully, because I understand this may come as something of a shock." Brenda felt Mark go very still beside her. "You're pregnant," the doctor said. "Approximately 8 weeks, based on the hormone levels we're seeing. The fainting episode is consistent with early pregnancy, low blood sugar, blood pressure changes. Given the timeline, I'd expect you're only just now starting to feel symptoms." For a long moment, nobody in the room said anything at all. Brenda heard the words. She understood them, individually the way you understand words in a language you've only half learned, pregnant, 8 weeks, symptoms, but strung together they refused to arrange themselves into something she could actually absorb. She turned to look at Mark, expecting to find in his face some reflection of her own confusion, and found instead something closer to devastation. "That's not possible," he said quietly. The doctor's expression shifted, careful now, professional. "I understand there may be history here I'm not aware of. But the test results are unambiguous, Mr. Villegas. I can order additional confirmation if you'd like, but—" "I was told," Mark said, and his voice had gone strange, stripped down to something raw Brenda had never heard from him before, years ago, by 3 separate specialists, that I would never father a child. That it wasn't medically possible. Not unlikely. Not possible. The silence that followed felt enormous. Brenda watched him sit with his hands braced against his knees, staring at some point on the floor like the answer might be written there, and understood, watching him, that whatever was happening in that hospital room had cracked something open in him that had been sealed shut for a very long time. "I'd need his medical records to speak to that history specifically," the doctor said carefully. "But I can tell you what's in front of me right now. Mrs. Villegas is pregnant. The pregnancy appears viable. Given her age and general health, there's reason for optimism, though given the circumstances, and I understand there may be complicating medical history here, I'd want to monitor this closely. High risk until we know more." Brenda reached, without entirely deciding to, for Mark's hand, and felt him grip hers back hard enough to hurt. "I don't understand," she said quietly, to no one in particular, to the room, to the strange, impossible fact now settling itself somewhere behind her ribs. "Neither do I," Mark said. And for the first time since she'd known him, his voice cracked, just slightly, around the edges of something that sounded almost like hope, fighting its way up through years of having been told, definitively, that hope wasn't something the universe owed him. Outside the window, the city lights blurred against the dark, indifferent to the fact that somewhere inside that hospital, an impossibility had just quietly rewritten the terms of everything. It took 11 days for the story to leak, which was, Mark said grimly over breakfast, 11 days longer than he'd expected given how many people had access to the hospital's records. The headline ran in one of the city's less scrupulous outlets first. Viegas heir? The pregnancy no one saw coming, before it spread, inevitably, to the ones with better production values and worse intentions. Brenda hadn't understood, until she watched Mark's face as he read it, exactly how dangerous a piece of information could be. "It's not the tabloids I'm worried about," he said, setting his phone face down on the table with a precision that suggested restraint rather than calm. "It's who reads them. Every family with a grudge against mine is going to look at this headline and see one thing, that I have an heir now. Real or not. That changes what I'm worth to negotiate with. And what I'm worth to eliminate." "Eliminate," Brenda repeated, and the word sat strangely in her mouth, too blunt for the quiet kitchen they'd shared so many easier evenings in. "I'm not going to lie to you about what this world is," he said. "I'd rather you understand the risk than feel safe by accident." The days that followed brought a security detail that doubled, then tripled, cameras added to entrances that already had cameras, and a tightness in Mark that Brenda recognized now as fear wearing the mask of control. He didn't say much about the specialists who'd once told him, with total certainty, that this pregnancy shouldn't exist. But she caught him some nights standing in his study long after the house had gone quiet, staring at nothing, and she understood that the impossibility of it hadn't stopped haunting him just because the doctor had confirmed it was real. It was Elena, of all people, who gave her the idea, mentioning offhandedly one afternoon that the estate kept an entire room of old family records in the lower level, correspondence, ledgers, medical files going back decades, the kind of paper trail families like the Viegases apparently never threw away, only buried. Brenda went down there on a Tuesday while Mark was in meetings, telling herself she was only looking for context, only trying to understand the family she'd married into a little better. She told herself that for almost an hour, working through boxes of old letters and financial records with a particular patience she'd once used sanding down furniture nobody else believed was worth saving, before she found the folder that made her stop entirely. It was tucked behind a stack of unrelated correspondence, the label faded but legible, medical, confidential, and inside it, alongside records she recognized as belonging to the specialists Mark had mentioned, was a second set of documents. Newer. A different letterhead. A different name attached to the request for records. Roberto Viegas. Brenda sat back on her heels in the dim light of the records room and read through it twice before she let herself believe what she was looking at. The original diagnosis, the one Mark had lived under for years, the one that had convinced him, permanently, that fatherhood wasn't a possibility available to him, had been reviewed a second time quietly for years after the fact by an independent specialist Roberto himself had apparently commissioned. And that second opinion, buried here in a folder nobody was ever meant to find, told a very different story. A treatable condition, the notes read. Not infertility. Something with odds, not certainties. Something that had, apparently, resolved itself in the years since, unbeknownst to the one person it should have mattered to most. Roberto had known. For years, Roberto had known that Mark's condition wasn't the closed door he believed it to be, and had said nothing, had let his nephew build an entire understanding of his own future on a diagnosis that was no longer true, while positioning himself, patiently, agreeably, as the natural heir to an empire that would otherwise pass to children Mark believed he'd never have. Brenda sat very still in the quiet of that room, the folder open across her knees, and felt something cold settle low in her stomach that had nothing to do with the pregnancy. She thought about Roberto at family dinners, soft-spoken and endlessly agreeable, the Uncle Mark had never once thought to be suspicious of. She thought about the leak to the press, timed so precisely to do maximum damage, and wondered, with a growing unease, whether the man who'd buried this diagnosis, might also be the man who'd made sure the whole city learned about the pregnancy before Mark had a chance to protect it. She didn't go to Mark right away. She sat with it first, turning the pages over carefully, memorizing dates, names, the particular clinical language of a lie a decade in the making, understanding that whatever she did next would break something in her husband that had already been broken once and had only just, tentatively, begun to heal. But she also understood, closing the folder at last and rising slowly to her feet, that she couldn't sit on this. Not with a child growing inside her that someone in this house had apparently decided, long before her arrival, should never have been allowed to exist. Brenda found Mark in his study a little past 10 that night, and she didn't say anything at first, just set the folder down on the desk in front of him, closed, and watched his face as he looked up at her and then down at it. "What is this?" "I think you should sit down before you open it." He didn't sit. He never did, when something mattered. He opened the folder standing, and Brenda watched the color drain slowly out of his face as he worked through the pages, watched his jaw tighten in that way she'd come to recognize as the only outward sign he allowed himself when something had genuinely wounded him. "For years," he said finally, quietly, more to himself than to her. "He's known for 4 years. I'm sorry, don't be." He closed the folder, and when he looked up at her, whatever softness had been building between them these past weeks had hardened into something else entirely. Cold, precise, the same expression she imagined he wore in rooms she was never invited into. "You found what I should have found years ago." He didn't sleep that night. Brenda woke twice and found a side of the bed empty, and both times she found him in the study, going through the rest of the records room's contents with the methodical patience of a man building a case rather than nursing a grief. By morning, he had more than the one folder. He had 4 years of quiet, careful documentation, the second diagnosis, the specialist notes, and, worse, a paper trail leading back to a payment made to a junior staffer at the hospital where Brenda had been treated, a payment traced, eventually, to an account Roberto had thought well hidden. The family was called together 2 days later, on short notice, in the same formal dining room where Brenda had collapsed weeks earlier. She wasn't sure, until the last moment, whether Mark wanted her there at all, but he'd asked her that morning, simply if she was willing, and she'd said yes before she let herself think too hard about what it would cost her to sit through it. Roberto arrived last, as he always did, unhurried and pleasant, kissing Brenda's cheek in greeting like nothing in the world had changed. She made herself smile back at him and hated how easily the smile came, how practiced his warmth was, how completely she'd have believed it herself a month ago. Mark waited until everyone was seated before he spoke, and when he did, his voice carried the particular stillness of a man who had rehearsed calm because the alternative frightened even him. 4 years ago, he said, I was told a piece of information about my own body that shaped every decision I've made since. About marriage. About legacy. About what I believed I was and wasn't capable of building. He set the folder down in the center of the table, unopened, and let it sit there a moment before he continued. That information was false. And someone in this family has known it was false for 4 years, and let me believe otherwise. The room went very quiet. Brenda watched Roberto's face carefully and saw, for just a fraction of a second, something flicker beneath the practiced calm. There and gone, but she'd seen it, and she suspected Mark had too. That's a serious accusation, Roberto said smoothly. I'd want to see whatever's led you to it before. You commissioned the second opinion yourself, Mark said. Under an assumed clinic name.
4 years ago.
And when it came back different from what I'd been told, you buried it. You let me spend 4 more years believing a door was closed that you knew, personally, had opened. He opened the folder now, laid the pages out one by one, unhurried, letting each one land. And when my wife's pregnancy became public knowledge before I'd even had the chance to process it myself, I found a payment in your name to a hospital records clerk, made 3 days before the story broke. Mark, Roberto started, and for the first time in all the months Brenda had known this family, she heard something crack in that endlessly agreeable voice. You didn't just steal 4 years from me, Mark said, and his voice, quiet as it was, filled the entire room. You put my wife and my child in danger the moment it became convenient for you to do so. You decided an heir I didn't know I could have was worth more to you buried than it was worth to me, alive and safe. Nobody at the table spoke. Roberto's face had gone the color of old paper, the same color Ruth's had gone that first afternoon in the shop doorway, and Brenda understood, watching him, that whatever ground he'd spent years quietly building beneath himself had just given out entirely. You're finished, Mark said simply. Not just from the business. From this family, in any capacity that matters. You'll have no access, no name, no claim to anything that carries the Villegas name going forward. I'd suggest you consider that generous, given what you've cost me. Roberto opened his mouth once, as if to argue, and then seemed to think better of it, some final calculation running behind his eyes before he settled instead into silence. He rose from the table without another word, and the room watched him go, the bell of the front door somewhere in the distance, the only sound marking his exit, smaller, Brenda thought, than she'd expected it to be, for a betrayal that had cost so much. Mark didn't move for a long moment after the door closed. Then he sat down heavily in the chair beside Brenda's, and under the table, without a word to anyone else still seated there, he reached for her hand and held it like he needed to remind himself, again, that the thing Roberto had tried to bury was still, impossibly real. The last month of the pregnancy passed the way the doctor had warned her it might, carefully, watchfully, with more appointments than Brenda could easily keep track of, and a specialist added to the rotation who monitored her blood pressure with an attentiveness that occasionally tipped into alarm. High risk. The word she'd first heard in that hospital room months ago had become the quiet undercurrent of every week since, and by the time she reached her final weeks, Mark had rearranged his entire schedule around the possibility that anything could happen at any hour. It happened on a Thursday, fittingly enough, the same day of the week he'd first walked into her kitchen and upended her life entirely. The contractions started slow, manageable, and then, within a handful of hours, became something else entirely. By the time they reached the hospital, the doctor's careful calm had shifted into something more urgent, and Brenda caught, in the flurry of movement around her, enough fragments of the conversation to understand that this labor was not going the easy way anyone had hoped for. She didn't remember all of it clearly afterward. 18 hours blurred together into pain and fluorescent light, and Mark's hand gripping hers through every hour of it, his composure, the same composure that had once made grown men look away rather than meet his eyes, cracking further with every hour that passed. She remembered a moment, somewhere near the worst of it, when the machines beeped in a rhythm that made 3 different people move at once, and she remembered Mark's voice, low and fierce, telling her to stay with him, just stay with him, like the sheer force of his will alone might be enough to keep her there. And then, finally, impossibly, after everything, a sound. Small, furious, entirely alive. Brenda came back to herself slowly, exhausted in a way she'd never known a body could be exhausted, and found Mark standing at the edge of the bed with their daughter cradled against his chest, looking down at her with an expression Brenda had never once seen on his face in all the months she'd known him. Not the careful composure of the man who'd walked into her kitchen that first day. Not even the guarded warmth that had grown between them since. Something else entirely, something undone, something that had given up, finally and completely, on protecting itself. She's here, he said, and his voice broke on the second word, the same way Carol's, no Ruth's, had cracked that first afternoon in the shop, except this time it wasn't fear that broke it. Let me see her, Brenda whispered, and he crossed the room and placed their daughter carefully in her arms, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, both of them simply looking down at the small, furious, impossible fact of her, dark hair already, a set to her jaw that Brenda suspected, with a rush of tenderness she'd inherited from her father. Isabella, Mark said quietly. They'd settled on the name weeks ago, late one night in the kitchen, but hearing him say it now, looking at the daughter it belonged to, it sounded like something new entirely. Isabella, Brenda agreed. He sat carefully on the edge of the bed beside her, and for a while they simply stayed like that, the 3 of them, in the particular hush of a hospital room in the very early hours of morning, the kind of quiet that felt nothing like the cold, careful silences that had once filled the halls of his estate. I spent years, Mark said finally, Believing this specific kind of mourning wasn't something the world owed me. I built an entire life around that belief. And I was wrong about all of it. You weren't wrong to protect yourself, Brenda said. You just didn't know yet what you were protecting yourself from. He looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the same something that had first flickered across it in her kitchen doorway all those months ago, there and gone before she could fully name it, settled now, finally, into something permanent. I told you once you didn't owe me a child, he said. I meant it. I still mean it. But you gave me one anyway. And somewhere along the way, without my noticing exactly when it happened, you gave me something I'd stopped believing I was allowed to want at all. What's that? He looked down at Isabella, asleep now in her mother's arms, one small fist curled against the blanket, and then back up at Brenda, and for the first time since she'd married him, a cold, businesslike arrangement built on a debt neither of them had chosen. His voice carried nothing careful in it at all. A family, he said. A real one. Not the kind I thought I'd bought with a signature on a piece of paper. The kind I didn't know I was allowed to have until you were the one standing in front of me, refusing to let me settle for less. Outside the window, the sky had begun to lighten toward morning, the same gray, uncertain color it had been the day he'd first walked into her kitchen and told her about a debt that wasn't hers to carry. Everything that had followed from that morning, the wedding, the estate, the breach, the collapse, the betrayal unearthed and answered for, had led, improbably, to this, a small, warm room, a daughter neither of them had believed possible, and a man who had finally, completely, stopped protecting himself from the one thing he'd wanted most.